My name is Steve Staniford, and I'm the Dean of the Schrader Family School of Business Administration. But more importantly today, I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, Dan Miller. Many of you I know already know Dan. In fact, it was interesting how he was reintroducing himself to many of you as you walked through the door, and I know many of you are familiar with his background. Most exciting for me, Dan is now the director of the Institute for Global Enterprise in Indiana. He's a veteran in that position. He's been in that position now a week and a half. So he's off to a great start. I can hardly believe it's only been a week and a half based on what already has been done. But just to tell you a little bit more about his background, Dan was an executive vice president at Kimball International and president of the Kimball Furniture Group. And obviously in that role was very involved in the organization's international activities. He was an executive vice president for Latin America in Whirlpool, and actually spent a fair amount of time living in Latin America, if I remember right.
Sao Paulo.
And Sao Paulo, very exciting. And was president and CEO of International Knife and Saw, and president and CEO of Overhead Door Corporation. One of the things I think is kind of interesting is Dan is actually a University of Evansville alum. He's actually an alum from the business school, which is very exciting for us. We're always happy to bring alum back. He was previously a member of the University of Evansville Board of Trustees and continues to serve as a director on Cook Enterprises. So he's obviously very connected and integrated into the community. He is, I can tell you after our extensive working together of a week and a half, he is a passionate advocate of global education. And that to me is he brings a lot of depth, but that passion is one of the things that excites me most. And obviously given his extensive experience in both the academic administration of the university, which has been really helpful, but then also as an executive in general, we're really excited that he's part of the Institute and can be a speaker here today. He is going to talk about, when I saw this topic, I'm like, I've got to be there. This sounds really interesting. Because many of us have heard of the brick companies. And Dan's going to talk about this a little bit more. I have not heard much about the CVETs, I think it's Civets is how it's pronounced. But the topic is brick and civets, emerging economies you need to know. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dan, and you can take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Well, good afternoon. It's kind of my first coming out as in this new role as a director. I think Steve and I are going to work together great. He brings a lot of experience around international business and a great success around education at some fine universities. You add that to Tom Kazee, the relatively new president, a little over a year at the university, and a new strategic plan that's been approved. So we've got a lot going on, and it's really exciting, and I think the way that it's fitting together is really a very good thing. So hopefully you'll be hearing positive and good things about the university going forward. I'm going to kind of talk about three things. The first two will be very quick, and then the third is really probably the reason most of you are here, talking about BRIC and civets and emerging economies. First, let me talk just a little bit. I have to give a commercial for the Institute for Global Enterprise in Indiana. Every time I say that, I always worry I'm not going to get all that in before people start looking away. But the Institute is really intended as a result of a grant from the Lilly Foundation to help Southern Indiana in three primary ways. First, it's working with companies and businesses to expand or deepen their knowledge and understanding of global markets, importing, exporting. We're not going to teach Toyota or Alcoa or Mead Johnson Nutritionals how to be global. In fact, we hope to bring people from companies like that to help us and teach our students and work with our faculty. But there are a lot of mid and small-sized companies who either are doing business globally and maybe haven't had such a great success, or want to expand, or they've done it in one direction. Maybe they've bought but not sold, and they may want to look at going in both directions. So we want to work with them and find out the things from them that we may be able to help with, and we'll be developing and adding to some of the programs that we already have at the Institute. The second kind of constituency is really the faculty, and we have a couple of faculty members here today. The faculty understands that globalization is an important part of what we stand for and want to stand for more clearly at the university and in the Schrader Family School of Business Administration. So I'll be working with them as they work on their curriculum to make sure that we're providing help on globalizing the appropriate parts of their curriculum and classwork. We also want to make sure that we're bringing resources to them that we might have access to, some of those people from the business community. And maybe the most important are the students. I mean, that's what we exist for at the university. And we have a huge number of international students now. We have an extraordinarily high rate of students getting an overseas experience, not just at Harlexton, our campus in England, but in a lot of other countries. So we are well down the road of learning and making that become an even more important part of the curriculum at the university. But we really want to help those students get more experiences and exposure in a variety of ways to international business, culture, politics, all of the things that go into really being a global citizen, because we are one of those whether we like it or not. So that's the first part. Second part, Steve gave a little bit of my background, my bona fides. I think it's important maybe that you understand the perspective from which I come and the experiences which I have had and how that relates to what I'm going to talk about for the subject today. Steve mentioned a few of the things that I've had in my jobs. I've visited over 50 countries. I've done business in probably 35 countries. So I have experience, some good, some not so good, in working and living in other parts of the world. And it is something that when I joined Whirlpool Corporation in 1987, that was really one of the primary reasons that motivated me to go to work for them. They were they were beginning to globalize the business and the company at that point. They decided that there were eventually going to be 3 or 4 global manufacturers of appliances in the world, and they were going to be the first and the biggest and the best. And they've moved pretty effectively, certainly at being the biggest, which they are today after the Maytag and other acquisitions. And I think they are a good model for globalizing a company successfully. And I was a part of that in a variety of jobs that I had, including living in Sao Paulo, Brazil for almost 6 years and running the Latin American business, which was, by our geography, everything south of Mexico. It was a great personal and professional experience, so it was a great thing. I would highly recommend learning more about South America, Latin America, because lots of people have stars in their eyes over Asia, which they should, but there's a lot of opportunity down there. A little plug for Brazil and other places. Steve talked a little bit about Kimball. We globalized the supply chain, particularly in our hotel business, by basically at that point moving most manufacturing offshore. We were finding it nearly impossible to compete and be successful by manufacturing hotel furniture in the United States. So we fundamentally moved the supply chain first to China and a little bit to Malaysia. We began to migrate some of that to Vietnam, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We were looking at Indonesia, Bangladesh, and some other places that had resources, skilled labor, cheap labor. But now an interesting thing is happening in that some of those jobs in the furniture industry in general, residential and office furniture, some of those jobs are beginning to move back to the United States. It's the distance, it's the increase in cost, it's the risk that you have associated with lots of things like currency risk, trade exchange rates, but some of it is just the time value of money with all that time on the water getting from there to here. We haven't found a way to move China closer to the United States, so that's a reality, and we weren't shipping little bitty parts, electronic parts or whatever. We had to put our stuff on a boat, and that takes a while. So I think that's a trend, and maybe we can even talk a little bit about that as if you have questions about that toward the end. And I'm not going to fill up all this time with my voice. I want to talk about the things that might be on your mind, the questions that you might have. Another thing that kind of gets lost, last thing I'll mention is Overhead Door Corporation is the largest manufacturer of garage door openers and industrial and residential doors in the United States. And they are owned by a Japanese company. So in my couple of years as president there, I worked and was regularly in Japan, learning how they do things around lean, quality, Japanese business practices, and it's kind of like I said about my experience in Brazil. A lot of those I really liked, and a lot of them I was glad I only did once. So it was nice to move on from that, but it was a great experience. So that's a little bit about my background, and if you hear that, it might help you to understand that I had a big, thick passport and have been to a lot of the places that we're going to talk about here now. Okay? BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It was a term coined at Goldman Sachs in about 2003, and it identified the biggest emerging markets in the world, and they still are. They represent, I want to make sure I get some of this correct, they represent about 40% of the world's population, 25% of the land area in the world. There is huge disparity in the GDP of those countries and the GDP per capita of those countries. Even though they are kind of lumped together in this acronym, they are very different. And how you do business in Russia is very different compared to how you might do business in Brazil, India, or China. The rule of law is a little bit different in each of those countries. You have to understand what the cultural differences are, and I think, in my view, the only way you do that is to actually be on the ground and spend some time there and learn to trust the locals to manage your business, because it is clear that not only Americans know how to manage businesses effectively. The projection for the next 5 years growth rates for those BRIC countries is an average of 4.9% increase per year in GDP. And to put that in perspective, that same forecast says the G7 countries are projected to grow about 1.8%. So you can see that the rate of growth, even though the starting point is not so relative to the United States or Germany or Japan, is not enormous except for China, you can see that they will start to catch up with those disparity in growth rates. And even if they miss a bit, and who knows how things might change given all the things that are going on in the world, the likelihood of them growing at a multiple of the more developed countries is very, very high. Here's another thing that might help put it in perspective. And again, these are projections. By 2050, and I hope I'm still around doing something in 2050, the projected size of the top 5 economies in the world in rank order are China 1, US 2, India 3, Brazil 5, and Russia 6. So of the top 10, 4 are going to be BRIC countries along with the United States. So you don't hear Japan on that list, you don't hear Germany on that list. Not that they're going to shrink, but these other countries are just going to continue to grow. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think as you might think about doing business in those countries, it's important to understand that even though they have one acronym for BRIC, the implications of what it takes to be successful there are enormous. Lots of companies would tell you that they are willing to invest for the much longer term in places like China and India because of the potential and the opportunity to either be a supply base or an export market or both, but you have to have a certain amount of patience. And with our quarterly earnings focus in the United States, depending on how big of a part of your mix of sales and profits, that can be great if you've been at it for a while, like a Procter & Gamble or a Coke or a Cummins or a John Deere. But if you're a fairly newcomer to that, that can be a challenging story to try to tell your shareholders. So I think as you might think about doing business there, to consider whether or not you have the stomach for that kind of long pull is something that you should seriously consider before you make big investments there. But the payoff potential is enormous, and that's why so many people are going there. And lots of them, lots of multinationals, not just US-based companies, are finding great success there, be they Siemens or other European countries. So that's the acronym that It's kind of been in all the papers, so everybody knows that. But the newer one that is coming about, and I think was really kind of coined at the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Economist Magazine's research arm, in 2006, they coined this term civets. It's a cat. And civets stands for Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, and South Africa. Got our little maps here. This might help. So if you just look at this map, you can see most continents, except for Australia and Antarctica, represented. You can see that they are, in some cases, pretty big countries in terms of size. Indonesia, big population. But then you have other countries like Egypt, not so big, Turkey, not so big, Vietnam, not so big in terms of size. Both population and landmass. But the thing that I really find interesting about the civets possibilities are that they do have some characteristics that do kind of lead you to accept, at least to some degree, whether it makes sense to lump them together. They have large and young populations, the young being very important. So the domestic market opportunity in those countries is fairly large, but growing, and the opportunity for that to grow into the future is really significant. They have diversified economies. There are lots of things being done in Indonesia. In Colombia, their floral export business is probably the biggest in the world. They produce lots of oil. They produce other products that you don't necessarily associate with Colombia unless you study it a little bit more. And I'll talk a little bit more about each one in a minute. There's relative, and I emphasize that word, political stability. You might say, have you read about Egypt lately? Maybe that's not true. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And they have decent financial systems. Most of them, they have stock exchanges. They have banking systems that are able to support and either provide funding for or use as a conduit for direct foreign investment as companies decide to come into those countries, their countries, in one way or another. Mostly, they don't have high inflation. And when I say high inflation, I'll give you a Brazil story. When I moved to Brazil, the inflation rate was 15% a month. Okay? So when you got into a taxi cab in Sao Paulo, they didn't have a meter. They had a sheet that was an index, and it changed every day. One of the stories, and I've always said, I don't know if this is a true story, but it's a great story. When it was higher than that, when it was about 30% a month inflation rate, you would go into a restaurant and pay for your meal when you sat down, because if you waited till the end, the price might have gone up. So again, I don't know if that's true or not. I didn't experience that. So they have no huge trade imbalances. They are importing and exporting at roughly the same kinds of rates, and they don't have really serious sovereign debt issues like a lot of countries are experiencing these days. So those are the things that might tie them together. There are those people who say that this is a contrived gimmick to fit a name, that all these countries have little in common. I think you could argue that. I think there's a more compelling argument that there really are reasons to think of them as a group. Colombia, in the papers today, because of signing the trade pact along with South Korea, I can't remember the third country, we've been trying to do that for years, and I think it's high time that we do it. On the other side, their drug problem, narco-trafficking, is clearly an issue. When I was living in South America, we did business in Colombia and tried to do an acquisition there. We tried to buy an appliance company there. And when we went to Colombia and began to look at the books, we said, we know a lot about the appliance business, and we just don't see how you're making all this money. Well, they were laundering drug money. And plain and simple, you don't know who it is, I'm going to tell you who it is, but that was what was going on. So you have issues of personal security concerns that you would have to be careful about there. But I will tell you, if you have not been to Colombia, it is a beautiful country. It is almost 3 separate countries. It is trisected by 2 mountain ranges, and it is a marvelous country. And if you can get by some of those issues, it's a pretty nice place to visit. Indonesia, the two countries on both of these lists that I have not done business in or visited are Russia and Indonesia. So I can only speak about what I know in reading and dealing with people. I've done business with Indonesians in other parts of the world, but it's a big country. It is very diverse. It is a growing power clearly in that part of the world, and the downside there, the risk is around political and religious strife, and it seems to come and go a bit. So keeping that in your mind as you may visit there or try to do business there, I think would be important. Vietnam is a country I have a fair amount of knowledge and understanding and firsthand doing business there. One of the things that has begun to happen in the furniture industry is, as the supply base, the manufacturing base for furniture developed first in Taiwan in a big way. There are other countries, of course, that produce furniture. Those Taiwanese entrepreneurs moved to China, built enormous factories, and did big business. Basically took over the manufacturing for the residential furniture industry for the United States. I mean, well over 80% of furniture was being produced in China. China's labor got expensive. Vietnam came on board. Those entrepreneurs that had moved from Taiwan to China now began to build big factories in Vietnam, and they have enormous factories there. They have skill, they have capabilities, they have a supply base for finished materials, raw materials that followed them there, so they were able to move forward pretty quickly on developing a pretty effective supply base. I'm not certain exactly what it is today, but when we began to go to Vietnam for sourcing, wage rates in Vietnam, labor rates, were 1/3 of what they were in China. Lots of people find that hard to believe because they kind of have it in their mind, yeah, can't get any cheaper than China. Well, that's just not true. And the labor rates in China continue to increase, and it is, I believe it will be a significant issue that China has got to develop, as they are doing, their internal market to a much greater extent at a faster rate, because they will become less able to export with that labor cost advantage that they've had in the past. So Vietnam, again, beautiful country. Lots of people my age that have thoughts about Vietnam, and I remember the first time that I went through passport control. There were these 2 young Vietnamese, and I was not quite sure with what they were talking to each other about was something about this guy as an American or something about this guy as a businessman. That was the only time I ever had that feeling in Vietnam. It's a communist country, clearly, without any question, but they are committed to growth, and the government is doing a lot of things to encourage growth, and I think pretty successfully. I was in Egypt last year, and before the Arab Spring began, and it is a country with a highly educated workforce. It is both a blessing and kind of a curse for them. They have a highly educated workforce, but because unemployment is so high, they have a very frustrated workforce because they can't find jobs. And that, I believe, was part of the whole impetus behind the Arab Spring that started there. But Egypt is a country that goes back as far as any of them in terms of history. They are proud of that, their culture, their contributions to civilization over the years. And now if they can find ways to make that become a reality in terms of being more desirable on the world market, I think the opportunity that they have is great. It really is developed along the Nile River because the rest is desert, but the Nile allows them on lots of things like cotton, agriculture, other products. So it's an interesting country, and I would just tell you that from my own view, if there's one country on here that I kind of wonder about, it's Egypt. Now, I think they eventually will do just fine and have done fine, but I think they're going to be in for some pretty tough sorting out over the next few years. Turkey is really a great country, and I have to be careful because I have two experts from Turkey sitting right here in the front row, kind of checking me out. But Turkey is really in a great geographic and historic position. They're Western in some ways, so they can move in that area effectively. They are gateway to the Middle East, to other parts of Asia. They have a very diversified economy. They're part of the European Union now. I guess you could argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing right now. But they are a country that I believe really deserves to be on this list because I'm very positive about Turkey. South Africa is clearly kind of the entry point into Southern Africa. Again, beautiful country. There are some really strong regional companies in South Africa. So if you go to South Africa and try to compete against those companies, you need to be prepared. But if you can partner with them or find ways to do joint ventures with them or use them as suppliers or whatever, then I think South Africa could really be a possibility. You know, countries like Nigeria, which are primarily oil-dominated economies, they're not on this list because their economies just are not diversified enough. And I think that will, until they can find a way to parlay that into some of the things Dubai, for example, has tried to do around building a financial and tourist destination country. I think some of those countries in Africa are going to struggle with that. So that's kind of a quick run through those countries. So as I would advise and have advised companies that are talking about globalizing, what I suggest to them are to think about honestly a few things. What's your risk tolerance? What's your risk tolerance as a company, and what's your risk tolerance as an individual? And if it's not pretty high, you probably ought to stay home. Because the frustrations that are, the things that are frustrations to Americans going to some of these places to do business are just the way things go in most of those countries. So I would encourage you to think about how big of a part of your portfolio of business some of these countries might be, the kind of products you're going to do there. You're going to buy, sell, or do both. The products that could come from there can have great opportunity for you. So it doesn't have to be that you sell there materials, raw materials, technology. Those kinds of things could be great assets for your company as you're trying to globalize, bring some of it back to the United States potentially, and use it in other parts of the world as you might expand your global footprint. A willingness to trust local people and local management. I will never know as much about Brazil as Brazilians. I will never know as much about Turkey as Turks. So companies who have tried to use expatriate management over long periods of time have frequently found that to be a difficult model where they don't bring in the local people. There are plenty of smart people in lots of parts of the world, and because English may not be their first or second or third language, sometimes we associate that with perhaps not being as astute of business people, and I think that's a big mistake that a lot of companies make. If you don't have a tolerance or desire to embrace cultural, language, other differences, you probably should be very thoughtful about how aggressively you may want to go into, especially some of these emerging markets. Not quite so much some of the more developed, advanced, Western European in particular, Australia, those kinds of markets. Those are just different than these emerging markets. So one of the things I said I was going to talk a little bit about was personal investment side. Now I really should be careful in this building, so Dan, call me if I get out of line here. If you want to think about how can I invest in these countries and their growth and the opportunity, there are exchange-traded funds for every one of these countries. I think all of them have a stock exchange. I would say to you that even if you can invest, and you cannot as a foreigner invest in some of those countries directly, those are generally not for the faint of heart. And depending on what kind of time horizon and risk tolerance you have, ETFs may be a better option. there are also index funds. S&P has the Civets 60 Index. Didn't know that until I started doing some of this research. There's also an S&P BRIC 40. So that would be, you know, countries or companies in these countries, the BRIC countries. And there's also an S&P Emerging Market BMI that is really an index of some of those developing markets. So if you have some time and interest and skill, you can learn an awful lot. The internet is the great equalizer of knowledge spreading, and it's a great way to go and find out about different companies, the kind of industries you may be interested in or may know about. So from a personal investment standpoint, it could be interesting, but could be Mr. Toad's wild ride depending on how you're investing and where you're investing. One of the things we've been working on a little bit here at the university since I've been here a whole week and a half is talking about, and Pete, I made a slight adjustment on this, talking about what does globalization mean, okay? And this is a Dan Miller definition. You're not going to find it anyplace else, I don't think. I didn't intentionally steal it or plagiarize it, but this is based on my thoughts. I think globalization is understanding and embracing the impact and interaction of economic, political, and cultural issues around the world and how they affect me or us and how I affect or we affect them. I think that's what globalization, I think it's a mindset more than a clearly defined set of whatever. So, what would you like to talk about? Yes?
I wonder if you could say something about the state of organized labor in these countries. Are there labor organizations which operate independently of the state and of companies, manufacturers, and aggressively represent workers and wages and benefits?
In nearly all of these countries, labor unions are mandated by law. And in some cases, it is a factory or company-wide union. And in some cases, it's kind of a syndicated union for people in either a similar geographic area or an industry. I'll relate a couple of examples maybe to reinforce that. In China, and I don't want to overstate this, but back probably 5 or 10 years ago, you could kind of do whatever you wanted to in terms of how you treated your workers in China. Some of the companies treated them very well. It's very common to have dormitories and cafeteria, and people live there, the workers live there because they bring them in from the countryside, move them into these factories, and then they may go back home once or twice a year. Chinese New Year, typically everybody goes back home. So they would work 7 days a week. There were no limits on the number of hours that they would work. And in fact, some of the workers really didn't strongly object to that because they were trying to make as much money as they could to either go back home and buy some land or start a business or just improve their lot in life and give their children a better life in the next generation. That has begun to change, really, I think, over the last 5 to 7 years. And I'll contrast that with Vietnam. When these furniture companies that I mentioned went to Vietnam, what they found was the labor unions in Vietnam are really serious. They shut factories down pretty regularly. If they're working too many hours, if the working conditions are not safe by their standards, probably not necessarily by OSHA standards, but it is a reality that you really have to understand how to deal with that, and I think would go back to that idea of you need local people deeply involved in generally managing your businesses there. Did that answer your question?
Yes, you said mandated by the state in many cases, and that doesn't sound too independent to me.
The fact that workers have the right and nearly the obligation to organize into a union is provided for by law. How that is, the contracts are negotiated and how that is put into practice is more company by company, union by union. And that varies somewhat by by country. I'm kind of trying to lump a lot of countries together with that. Yes?
Two-part question. One, how is workers' compensation viewed in these countries? And the second part of that question is, how did you insure your manufacturing centers? Or did you insure your manufacturing centers in these countries?
Insure from the standpoint of flood insurance or work stoppage insurance or whatever?
Yes.
Okay. I may lose track of those, so you may have to remind me about the two. What was the first one again? The first part?
The workers' compensation.
I would bet you that in a number of these countries, the phrase workers' compensation doesn't translate. Injuries to workers are really depend on the company. And there are a lot of companies, not just multinationals, who would generally apply their own code around how they treat their employees, but other companies who may be owned by a Vietnamese or a Chinese or an Indonesian, it would vary widely on how they might take care of their workers in the case of an injury or something like that. I would tell you that I think more frequently than not, it's just kind of too bad. So insurance, I think that there are certainly companies that insure people or organizations or facilities or factories or workers around the world, but one of the biggest suppliers that we had in China there was a massive flood, and basically their entire factory was wiped out. They had some insurance. This was probably an investment that was worth maybe $50 million. It was a pretty good-sized factory. It was completely shut down. I think they had about $5 million worth of insurance, so the rest of it had to come from someplace else, the entrepreneur's own pocket or investors or whatever. So insurance is certainly a concept they understand, but it's not as I think as commonly held a belief that you have to have it, and is it worth the cost of it. So again, that could vary really widely from country to country.
Thank you.
Yes.
In most of these countries, I would say that protectionism is fairly high right now, specifically 65% import duties in Brazil, which if you live there 6 years, you know very well. So I wonder how you were able to mitigate that, minimize it as much as possible, and maybe you can compare some other countries that are less protectionist.
Protectionism is in the eye of the beholder. We like to hold ourselves up as the least protectionist country around. My experience says that's not true. We are among those, but Chile, for example, has had no trade barriers, either real tariffs or informal barriers, for decades, literally. And that's how they grew, because they said, we're just going to open it up. The best product, the best services, the best companies are going to win. Trade pacts have been formed. NAFTA, of course. There's Mercosur, which is the southern cone, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina. There's the CARICOM, all the Caribbean countries. There are all those trade pacts. And they generally have little to no tariffs. Tariffs are just something that you have to decide if you can stand the gaff on or not. There are some accounting things you can do we used to call it industrial tourism in Brazil, where you would bring products into the northern part of the country into Manaus, which is a big city in the middle of the Amazon rainforest that was a tax-free zone that the government set up. They wanted to develop Manaus. You could bring components into Manaus, and basically the electronics and some of the appliance industry almost completely moved to Manaus But what they would do is just bring in components and assemble them. So there was no import duty coming from microwave oven parts from Korea, and there was no tax, either state or sales tax or value-added tax. As they shipped them out, the tax began after that. So some people would say that was protectionist because it protected Brazilian companies who were operating there. Argentina had the same thing in the southern part on Ushuaia, exactly the same thing. Countries use protectionism for a variety of reasons. Some, I think, fairly legitimate to develop, but as people become more and more part of the World Trade Organization and really become part of the world order, I think those will diminish, but I think it will be a very long time before they go away, because the developing countries will say, well, you've already been through all of that we're going through. In effect, you protected yourselves in reality, and now we're just doing the same things that you did. Now, that's a real philosophical answer to your question, but let me be a little bit more practical. If you have a 45% import duty on a component for a car, that may not be a deal killer. If it's a relatively small part of the cost of whatever you're making, kind of who cares? If it is on steel or some other fundamental material that you need, you're probably going to have to figure out how to buy that domestically. Brazil used to have what they called an import substitution model. Brazil's belief was they were big enough. You know, there are about 250 million people in Brazil. Its land mass is about the same size as the continental United States. And back a number of years ago, but maybe 35 years ago, they thought they could develop everything themselves, from technology to basic industries, mining, steel, you name it, and they thought they could kind of keep the world away. Well, it didn't work. It has never worked. And what they found was they had industries that were in enormous disrepair. It had to be rebuilt. They had to rely on both Brazilian people, banks to fund it, and they had to rely on foreign direct investment. And as a result of that, they began to phase out over time some of these import duties. Frequently, the countries will pick those fundamental to them that they believe are critical industries that they will continue to protect in one way or another. Sorry, long answer to your question. Did I answer it, or I just talk a long time? Okay. Yes?
Is it dreaming to think that we here in the city of Evansville and in the state of Indiana could realistically export to these countries that you're discussing? And what should we be doing to facilitate that from a public policy standpoint, tax policy, etc.? I mean, as time goes on, it seems that transportation becomes a bigger and bigger factor because of energy price increases. Is that just dreaming way out there to think that we could actually export to the developing world?
I sure don't think that that's a dream. I don't think everything that we make here is going to be exportable, either desirable as a product with quality or cost to other parts of the world. But there are an awful lot of things that we make that I believe can be exported. If there are relatively undeveloped industries in certain countries that could be export markets, we may not be able to export something to Vietnam, but we might be able to export it to Egypt or Turkey, to use some of the CIVITS countries. I think you have to be careful that you don't try to make one size fit all. So I'm absolutely convinced that there are opportunities to either buy from or sell to other countries.
So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. We know that years and years ago here in Evansville, we made these little stationary engines that were used in agricultural applications to run pumps and light plants and all different kinds of things for agricultural applications. They were extremely heavy and were made out of cast iron. But they provided a very, very useful and durable power source for people that lived on farms. I'm not saying that we should recreate that sort of thing, but it would seem to me that in many of these developing countries that do not have energy grids built out to their entire rural areas, that we should be able to identify certain products and things that could be used in foreign countries to sell to them. But how you get there and identify what those items would be is a whole different ballgame.
I think that's the beauty of the free enterprise system. If you want to compete, you have to find the right kind of idea. You have to design the product in a way using materials or capabilities or technology so that it becomes valuable to other people. Unless you have an enormously powerful brand name that emerging countries want to wear Gap jeans or drink Coca-Cola or use Crest toothpaste or drive Chryslers or General Motors cars, you'll get a sliver that want to do that, but not so much. So I think, use your example. If you used to make them out of cast iron, those engines, now you have to find a way to lean out your operations in both product development, technology, and the materials that you use. And if you can't find a way to do that, then you should go peddle your paper someplace else. But if you are committed to trying to find a way to make that work, you might find a way to make that work in another country as an export, but you might find a way to sell it in the United States and make more money on what you're selling here. So I think there's kind of you get synergy out of those kinds of things. Your question about tax policy, and that's out of my depth. We have to get somebody else. I have feelings about it, but I don't have the personal experience around that. I think the biggest issue is education in most of these countries. The joke about Brazil is and was, it is the country of the future and always will be. They could never quite get themselves to where they could sustain over periods of time economic prosperity. They've had a pretty good run here the last couple of decades, really, probably 15 years. But I always maintain and still maintain that the key to what is holding them back in most of the countries that we've talked about here today is their education systems. Some have highly advanced. Some, we underestimate the effectiveness of their education systems. I think the biggest issue, wherever I have been in the world, certain things are true. Parents want a better life for their children. And one of the ways that they understand they can get a better life for their children is to educate them more. And they will do whatever it takes in terms of sacrifice, giving things up, living in a factory that is 1,000 miles away from their home in order to help educate their children. We don't have that intensity in our country. And I think that's one of the things that is allowing other countries to catch up to us. So I think we have great basis, but we have a lot of things that we need to work on. Tax policy, those kinds of things, those are all going to help. But until we get some of the intensity back around fundamental things, I think BRIC countries are going to grow at 4.9%, and we're going to grow at 1.8%. I've run over my time. Two more questions, quickly. So I'm over. If anybody needs to head out, feel free.
You talked about labor coming back to the United States. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Use an example in the furniture business, hotel furniture business. Kimball Hospitality business is if not the biggest, one of the biggest suppliers of in-room furniture to hotels in the world. And we had fundamentally moved that supply chain to Asia. In the last 2.5 years, we are bringing back jobs to make seating, upholstered goods, big, bulky things, not those compact, heavy products you were talking about shipping. And the residential furniture industry is having a rejuvenation over in the Carolinas and other places that have historically been strongholds for manufacturing furniture. Those jobs are starting to come back because the advantage that some of those countries had around wages is not there anymore. The cost of transportation is becoming more and more of an issue. The risk tolerance around currency risk, sovereign risk, whatever, those things are encouraging people to say, we're going to bring those jobs back here. Yes?
I was going to ask about currency risks in light of the fall of the dollar.
I'm going to give you really an outlier view of currency risk. Okay, so take this for what it's worth. It's free. Whenever I was managing businesses in different parts of the world, I really didn't care what the currency was. Everybody brought it back to the dollar anyway in terms of how you decided whether you were being productive and efficient, and we let the treasurer figure out how to hedge that currency risk. I'm not saying it's not important and not a reality, but I think people who run businesses need to run their businesses, and people who hedge currency and understand currency, they need to do that because that's a real thing. But I think sometimes companies let that get in the way of what their business really is. Unless you're a bank, of course, or you're a currency trader, then that's a different story.
Are they still bringing it back to
No.
the States?
No, I mean, it's too onerous from a tax standpoint to bring. People don't repatriate money to the United States. It's been taxed once. It's going to get taxed again. And remember, all these countries that are growing so fast, they are hungry for additional investment. So why would you pay back 40% to our government when you can invest that and make 40% by keeping it in China or Brazil or Indonesia or wherever?
Isn't that a problem for us?
Oh, big time. Yes, that's kind of, again, out of my depth. That's a topic for another day, right, Lucy? Thank you all very much for coming in. I hope this was of value to you.
The preceding has been a presentation of ACES TV.